Hello, welcome to the Joyful and Rising podcast. My name is Hillary Ramos. I am so genuinely grateful that you are joining me in this space today. Many of you are here because you have been connected with me for years on TikTok or Instagram, Facebook, Substack. You've provided encouragement for me over the years, and you are much of the reason why I chose to do this now. But regardless of how you found this space, I want to take a few moments to talk about what this podcast is, why it exists, and why it feels like one of the most important things that I could be doing right now. 5 years ago, I started the Joyful and Rising online community in a really small space on Facebook. And it actually started out originally as a space where I was documenting my health journey after my son was born. At that time, I was a new mom. I think Liam was maybe 2, and I was a pediatric physical therapist, and I was struggling desperately with trying to juggle the chaos that is life as a mom who was working at that time full-time and trying to manage my mental and physical health. And then 2020 hit, and in the middle of all of that chaos, I felt something that I never expected. I felt a call to quit my job, to leave my career as a physical therapist that I had spent years trying to build, and come home full time. I've been home for 4 years now, and in those 4 years, life has taken a lot of twists and turns that I never would have expected. I've shared much of that with you guys. A lot of y'all who have been here for years have seen all of those stages of life. You've seen my faith journey. You've seen my struggles with mental health. You've seen me announce new pregnancies and new hardships. You've grieved with me and you have rejoiced with me through all of it. As many of you know, in early 2022, my second pregnancy with our oldest daughter quickly turned from a joy-filled experience to one of life-altering diagnoses. We were very quickly thrown into a world that I had only known on the other side as a medical provider. Our daughter Marcelly was born with a very rare terminal disorder called lissencephaly, as well as a myriad of other health complications. We went through genetic test after genetic test after genetic test trying to figure out why exactly she was born with so many complications. But it took us 2 years to finally discover the genetic condition that she had. That condition is very rare and it's understudied, but Josh, my husband, and I are both carriers of that condition. For almost 2 years, we walked through the trenches with Marcelly, and I would do it all over again. We endured dozens of hospital stays, surgeries, interventions, therapies, learning what it truly means to have a deeply rooted Christ-centered joy. Marcelly passed away about a month after we got those genetic results that we had been waiting for so long, and when I was already 7 weeks pregnant with our third child. Everything in those few weeks changed drastically. The grief was immense, and in many ways it still is, but it also forged a conviction within me that this is exactly where I'm called to be. And it's interesting because I had that same conviction when I left physical therapy, even though I didn't understand it. I had that same conviction when we originally got news that Marcelly was going to have many health complications at her anatomy scan, and I had the same conviction as we said goodbye to her. And I have the same conviction now, even though we don't always understand each of those pieces. There's this conviction within us that we've had for the last 3 years that this is exactly where we need to be. I put a sign up in our entryway, actually, not long after that anatomy scan that we had with Marcelly. It's one of those letter tile signs. Actually, I'm going to go get it. Hang on. Josh is the camera expert, so I'm not sure if this is going to be backwards when I show it to you guys. I guess we'll take a look at that in post-editing. But this tile sign has sat in our entryway for the last 3 years, and I don't know that I'm ever going to change it. But it has a verse on it from Esther chapter 4, and it says, "Perhaps you were created for such a time as this." I have often struggled in our journey asking God, why? Why did I go to school for so long? Why do I have so many student loans to come home? Why did we go through all of this hardship? What do you want me to do, God? I have often wrestled with the feeling that I'm not doing enough with where He has called me to be, or that I'm not doing good work, or that I'm just a bereaved mom. But I have to remind myself over and over again, it's why that sign still sits in our entryway, that this is where He has called us to be. This is where He has called me to be. Home with my children, homeschooling them, caring for them and for this home. And with that comes the opportunity to document it all and to choose storytelling, to share the real and raw process that is grief and learning to navigate life afterwards. I write and I share both as a mother and as an aspiring author because I believe that these are the kinds of stories that are meant to be shared. I know a lot of you are probably already wondering why I am starting a podcast. I've been on social media for a long time, so why a podcast? Why another podcast in this very saturated space that is podcast? And I get it, trust me. It's a very valid question. It's one that kept me very complacent in this space for a long time because, again, I struggled with that question of, am I doing a good work? What more do I have to offer for this space? Truthfully, I have tried to start this podcast a couple of times. I actually recorded an introductory episode several weeks ago, probably months ago now, and I said, that's not it. I've got to redo it. And that's my perfectionism kind of coming through there. But I told Josh, I said, today is the day. I've got to get this done. I've got to follow this call and be obedient and get this started. So he was so gracious and he took both of the kids out to Target for a Target date. I will say that part of me wanted to venture off to Target. I have a hard time saying no to a Target run, but he gave me the space to do this today, and I'm very grateful for that. So we've got our coffee, and so it begins. But to be honest, social media has me tired. Platforms like Instagram and TikTok and Facebook, all of it is just about fast dopamine, quick clicks. It's all about how fast you can grab somebody's attention. And I feel like oftentimes we're prioritizing clickbait over conversation. And y'all, I miss conversation. I miss it greatly. I miss depth. I miss critical thinking. I miss honesty. I miss bearing with one another. We are all so busy living lives in our phones. We are constantly forsaking genuine, messy fellowship for a digital farce, a poor substitute, and it's wrecking us relationally. It's wrecking our kids too. So this podcast is something that I kind of want to be an antidote for that. The key message for the Joyful and Rising podcast is this is the place for honest conversations about grief and faith and finding joy even in the hard things. It's about learning to let Christ carry us and rising through it while living well in the process. So what does it mean to live well? What does that mean? And to me, it means living as people with conviction. It means living as people with our eyes wide open, maybe for the first time in our lives. We have to start looking past the screens and start building legacies that we truly care about. And that might look different in different stages and phases of life and in grief, but it doesn't mean that it stops. We can't wait for grief to disappear before we allow ourselves to find joy and purpose. Living well means letting those things coexist. It means showing up in life oftentimes imperfectly, but always with intention. I don't want to dive too deeply into what I'm about to say because we'll probably talk about it in future podcast episodes, but I do want to spend a little bit of time touching on the way that much of our community responds to people who are grieving and to grief in general. When we think about what grief and mourning looked like in the past. A lot of us visualize, I think, the Victorian era and the grief expectations that came along with that era. And these were inspired largely by Queen Victoria herself, who had a lifelong mourning phase after her husband died. In this era, as many of you know, there were specific stages of mourning, and each stage had its own routines and rituals associated with it. But even as normalized as those were for that time, these would have looked bizarre in other times and in other cultures, right? So if you look at, for example, the mourning practices of ancient Egypt or ancient Greece or Rome, these routines and expectations would have looked bizarre. And today, I would say the way that many of us grieve would have looked stranger still. And my point with bringing that up is this. Over time, human beings have expressed grief in a multitude of ways. And sadly, I think that the one thing that all of these cultures have in common is that if anybody stepped beyond the expectations, the norms of that time, they were shamed for it. Historically, people who haven't mourned properly have suffered social consequences. We see that to this day. And I just can't help but think what a shame that is, that people at their most vulnerable are required to manage the expectations of other people. I mean, have you ever felt that? Like, that you had to perform your grief to make people comfortable, that you had to perform a specific way, act a specific way as you were grieving because you were afraid that if you didn't do it a certain way, people were going to analyze it, pick it apart, and say, how can you behave this way? That they would judge you for it. I think collectively, as a society, we lack nuance and grace when it comes to this subject. We lack an understanding that grief is not linear. Grief is not a monolith. Grief is not an experience that holds one feeling at a time. Grief very much is a journey, and it often involves a very complex blend of emotions that people are left to navigate alone, for fear that if they present the wrong one at the wrong time in the wrong way, they'll get judged for it. From a societal perspective, joy especially doesn't seem to have a place in grief. But that's completely contradictory to what Scripture teaches us. The gospel tells us that we have joy regardless of whether we are in grief and in sorrow and in suffering, regardless of whether we have trials and uncertainty because of who Christ is. That joy exists alongside suffering, and to the world, that might look odd because there's a light within people who love Christ even when they experience suffering. That light has a habit of exposing the darkness that lurks around us. So it makes sense that joy in the midst of hardship would seem a little bit odd. But the standards of the world are not the standards that we are called to follow, and joy does not have to wait. We do not have to wait for the right stage of our grief to let the love of Jesus and the purpose that He has given us shine. We don't have to wait until life is calm and our tears are dried up. The joy of Jesus is a beautiful thing because the joy of Jesus is the joy that we experience when we're sobbing on the bathroom floor, unsure of how we will face the day ahead. He meets us in that and He says, I will carry you. That is the joy that we experience. There are a few scriptures that come to mind when I think about all this, and I'd love to share some of those with you. The first one is Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. John 11:33-35. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, He was deeply moved in His spirit and greatly troubled. And He said, Where have you laid him? They said to Him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. 1 Thessalonians 4:13. We do not grieve as those who have no hope. Habakkuk 3:17-18. Though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. When we hold these promises close, we begin to see that joy does not wait for perfect circumstances. It appears in the midst of our everyday moments if we have eyes to notice. The Holy Spirit inspires us to experience and to notice those small joys as we move forward through the day. The baby giggling, the friend who brings us a warm cup of coffee because we've had no sleep, the spouse who gives us a hug and waits for us to be the one to let go first. Joy in these stages might not be loud. It might come in whispers, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be silenced. These moments deserve to be celebrated even in the sorrow. We just have to be courageous enough to take in those moments and to not believe the lie that we have to grieve the way that the world expects us to. These are the kinds of discussions that I want to have in this space because I think that they matter. Many of you know that I write on Substack, and sometimes I might read directly from a Substack blog post. Josh is hilarious and often says, I really wish that you would just record an audio recording of your blog because I would just sit there and listen to it. So I am going to try that for some of these episodes. I'll just read directly from blog posts that I posted. And other times I might bring Josh in as a guest or some other guests for us to have these discussions. I will admit that I'm trying to pace myself a bit. I get a little bit excited. I want to talk about everything, but this is very new for me and I want to do it well. So some things that I have in mind to talk about are how to respond when people hurt you as you're grieving, how to love people well who are grieving, how the concepts of impact and intention really, for lack of a better word, impacted my marriage with Josh. The full, beautiful story of our daughter Marcelly. I would love to take some time to share her full story with you. And then more practical things as well, how to talk about hard things like death with your kids. So if these are the kinds of messages that resonate with you, if these are the kinds of conversations that you value, if you're tired of the noise, if you're ready for depth, and this seems like a space that you want to be part of regularly, then I have 3 small favors to ask. First, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode, whether you are on Apple Podcasts or YouTube or any other podcast space. Make sure you subscribe. Secondly, please share this episode. Please share it with somebody that you think needs it the most. Sharing is one of the best ways for this podcast to gain traction. And finally, you can subscribe to my Substack that I've mentioned. It's totally free. You can unsubscribe at any time if you choose to do so. But that's where I really go a lot deeper into some of these topics because I have the time and I have the space. All of the links to my Substack, my Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, all of the things, those are linked in the notes for this episode. I would love to connect with you in those spaces as well. Thank you so much for being here. It means the world to me that you've decided to spend your time in this space. It is a joy to serve you here, and I'll see you next time.